Welcome to Freethought Matters, a TV show devoted to the views of those of us who are not devout and who care about secular government. I'm Laurie Gaylor, co-founder and co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation.
And I'm Andrew Seidel, a constitutional attorney and the director of strategic response for the Freedom from Religion Foundation. FFRF is a state church watchdog working to keep religion out of government and serves as the nation's largest association of freethinkers, mainly atheists and agnostics.
And we invite you to join us at ffrf.org. You can also phone 1-800-335-4021 and leave your name and address, and we'd be glad to send you more information. And we love your help because freedom depends on freethinkers.
Today, we are delighted to have as our guest U.S. Representative Jared Huffman, who represents California's 2nd District. He used his law degree to combat gender and race discrimination, defend the environment, and previously served in the California State Legislature.
And as we're recording this, Representative Jared Huffman is currently the only member of Congress who openly identifies as non-religious. A year ago, Representative Huffman accepted FFRF's Emperor Has No Clothes Award at our 41st annual convention. This special award is reserved for public figures who make known their dissent from religion.
We're going to be talking with him about that and also about the historic Congressional Freethought Caucus that he recently co-founded. We've got Representative Huffman via Skype from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much, Representative Huffman, for taking the time to join us.
Good to be with you.
So, Representative Huffman, several years ago, you were very brave and you came out publicly as, I believe, an agnostic and a humanist. Is that right?
More or less. Yeah, I can't remember the exact label, but that's basically what I have identified as for the last few years publicly.
So you're the only one publicly. What prompted you to come out of that closet?
It was a combination of things. Certainly the steady encroachment of religion into the public square, the efforts by Donald Trump and others to take us down the path to theocracy were deeply troubling to me. In addition to that, frankly, my mother passed away. She was deeply religious until her dying day, and it just became a little easier for me to be publicly honest about my religious views at that point, because it would have been a tough conversation with Mom.
You were raised Mormon, is that right?
I was. Yeah, I was in a branch of the Mormon Church. They were organized Latter-day Saints until it didn't work for me anymore. When I was about 19, I was away at college. I just started asking fairly critical questions and not finding answers, and it sort of unraveled from there for me personally.
And when you decided to come out of the closet, what else did you take into account? You know, there's this idea out there that being an open non-believer in Congress or in politics has a political cost. Did you make any sort of calculation like that when you were considering whether to make this announcement?
I had been thinking about it for years, frankly, even a couple years before that public announcement that you mentioned. I went on the Stephen Colbert show, for example. And he noticed in my biography that I was a little bit coy about my religious views. I wasn't identifying as any particular religion. And he jokingly asked me if I was atheist or agnostic, and I said, perhaps. So I was already thinking that it was time to just honestly state what I feel, who I am. But it was a couple more years before I did that officially and publicly.
So at our convention, you told a story about the feedback that you've gotten as a public non-believer because you had an election after you came out of the closet as a non-believer.
Yeah, and the conventional wisdom was just wrong. I got no blowback whatsoever, certainly no negative consequences to that announcement, and maybe a little bit of positive. I did get a lot of nice letters and emails from around the country, people thanking me for just being honest about it. Now, I do think the way you handle something like this really matters. And for me, I'm not in this to judge other people's religion or to be critical of their religious views. I try to be very respectful. It's such a deeply personal thing. And so, you know, I'd like to think that that's partly why I didn't get any political blowback and have had mostly support.
Do you think this is possible for other members of Congress to also come out without seeing any negative side effects?
I do. And, you know, I'm sure are certain districts around the country where that would not be the case. But I think for many districts, look, you've seen the data. You know that one of the fastest growing demographics in this country are people who are non-religious. And I don't think people really vote or expect their representative to agree with them, you know, based on religion. I think they're much more concerned with policy and things that matter in their day-to-day lives.
And didn't you overwhelmingly gain re-election in the last election in terms of getting feedback from your constituents?
I got my best numbers ever. So no evidence at all of a political price, and you know, possibly even some signs of greater respect and support. You know, I don't want to read too much into that, but certainly there was no blowback.
So do you have any idea how many closeted non-believers there might be in Congress?
Without naming any names.
Right.
Without naming, thank you. I definitely don't want to start outing people here on your show, although that would probably be good for ratings. There are quite a few. I have several friends, colleagues who I've had candid conversations with, and let's just say I am far from the only member of Congress to hold humanist or non-religious views. I'm just the only one that's, at this point, publicly identifying as such.
Well, and let's take a minute to talk about the community that you're trying to build in Congress for like-minded representatives, the Congressional Freethought Caucus that you co-founded with Representative Jamie Raskin. Can you tell us about that?
Yes. So I've gotten a lot of support from colleagues, and several of them, as we continue to talk about these issues and the importance of defending the secular character of our government, decided that we really ought to band together and form a caucus. So we settled on the name Freethought, the Congressional Freethought Caucus. Jamie Raskin and I are the original co-chairs, but other members include Jerry McNerney, Dan Kildee. We had a few in the previous Congress, but there's about 10 members of Congress right now, which is way better than I thought we would achieve in this Congress. So I think that tells you something, too. These are not all members that would characterize themselves as non-religious, but all of them are willing to at least publicly get out there and defend the secular character of our government and the line of separation between church and state. So I think that's a great thing.
So you're the only openly out non-believer, but this Freethought Caucus has several very important principles. It, for example, opposes discrimination against non-religious individuals. And I think one of the most important principles is to protect the secular character of our government and champion freedom of thought and conscience, including worldwide. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, look, the secular nature of our government is under constant attack. I mean, we are being invited to go down that slippery slope toward theocracy all the time. And a bunch of my Democratic colleagues, at least, some of the Republicans, I think, privately would be with us, but certainly a number of Democrats consider this to be a big deal. And so what we do with the Freethought Caucus is we file amicus briefs, for example, in litigation where we're defending those values. We are working on trying to get a humanist to offer the invocation for a session of Congress. This is not asking too much if we really are a secular government, and if the First Amendment prohibition against the establishment of religion really means something. We are holding interesting meetings on all sorts of different subjects. In fact, Jamie Raskin and I, now Jamie's terrific. He's a constitutional scholar, and his wheels are always turning about different strategies and ways to put this Freethought Caucus to work. But the latest idea that we're working on is to hold a meeting on the issue of what a theocracy looks like, and to have some experts talk to us about Saudi Arabia and Iran and how religious minorities are persecuted there. You know, I think we really should, you know, those who don't subscribe to Hulu and watch The Handmaid's Tale should start to educate themselves of the dark side, the downside of this theocracy push.
Well, we are thrilled that you are there to fight for this. I mean, FFRF exists because we are aware and get constant complaints about that push to theocracy. We get between 4,000 and 5,000 state church complaints every single year, so we're really happy to have some help at the congressional level. Any other big plans for the Congressional Freethought Caucus coming up?
I'm sure we'll be playing defense for the duration of the Trump administration.
Yes.
Because it seems like each passing week brings some new outrage. One of my personal favorites was when Secretary of State Pompeo a couple of weeks ago suggested that Donald Trump was like one of the Old Testament leaders that led Israel in a consequential war against Persians, and he thinks that that's playing out again in some kind of a religious context. It's just really deeply disturbing and creepy to see people in positions like Secretary of State saying things like that and taking actions that suggest that they're actually making policy on that basis.
Well, in the last minute that we have before our commercial break, I want to ask you a question that you posed to me on your podcast, Off the Cuff with Jared Huffman. Is there too much religion in politics right now?
So there's, I believe, too much religion in politics. There's also too much politics in religion. And I think the two, each of them is stronger when they're kept separate. So, the idea that, some are pushing, Ted Cruz and others, that we simply go ahead and let people openly campaign and engage in politics from the pulpit, that's troubling. But the way people are dragging their religion into Congress, into our public policy is just as troubling. We really need to defend this bright line of separation between the two.
Well, may I say amen, brother, to that. Take a little break.
Thank you, and thanks for all of your good work.
We're going to take a little break. This is Freethought Matters. We're talking with U.S. Representative Jared Huffman, and we'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Ron Reagan, an unabashed atheist, and I'm alarmed by the intrusions of religion into our secular government. That's why I'm asking you to support the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest and most effective association of atheists and agnostics, working to keep state and church separate, just like our founding fathers intended. Please support the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Ron Reagan, lifelong atheist, not afraid of burning in hell.
I never really had a single defining moment of coming out as an atheist, as they say. I considered myself non-religious, although I suppose there was always that feeling somewhere that God could be real, because billions of people thought it was true. Why would I know more than billions of people around the earth? I never specifically told my parents that I was non-religious, but I never really hid it from them either. By the time I was in high school, I was pretty much past believing in God or devils and ghosts, fairies, whatever. The topic never really came up much in my life because I didn't hang around with overly religious people, so I never discussed religion at any length or depth. But once I got to college, I decided to take an Intro to Philosophy course because I saw in the syllabus that there would be discussions on the various so-called proofs of God's existence. Well, that piqued my interest. So I was definitely curious to see what these proofs were, since I figured a proof, by definition, is a logical, well-reasoned, and airtight case. So I thought, well, maybe I was too hasty in my disbelief. So we learned about the ontological argument, the first cause argument, the cosmological argument, the design argument. After learning these and others, I distinctly remember being disappointed. Not because I learned that basically God isn't real, but because these proofs were easily disproved. Here I was, some 18-year-old college freshman, picking apart these proofs made by some of the history's most renowned philosophers. I realized that if those were the best arguments for God, then there really is no reason to believe, and that my assumptions had almost assuredly been correct all along.
I'm Laurie Gaylor with Freethought Matters.
And I'm Andrew Seidel, and we are talking via Skype with a brave guy, the only member of Congress, as this is being recorded, who identifies openly as non-religious, Representative Jared Huffman.
And Andrew, you were going to ask Jared a question.
I wanted to know if there is a particular freethinker from history that you might look up to more than others, for instance.
Favorite historic freethinker?
Yeah.
Let's see. I could be really provocative and say Jesus Christ, because if you take the divinity and a lot of the mythology out of the New Testament, the teachings of Jesus are fairly radical and wonderful. You know, as someone once said, I've got no problem with Jesus. It's just some of his followers that bother me. That is sometimes how I feel these days. A wonderful set of teachings. Other favorite freethinkers, obviously Thomas Paine, one of our great founders who probably would have memorials and monuments named after him, but for the fact that he was openly atheist. And of course, Kurt Vonnegut, you know, one of the best freethinkers of all time and one of my favorite authors.
All right.
Well, given the increasing numbers of secular Americans, about a quarter of the population, do you see seculars as successfully coalescing as a voting bloc?
I think we're making progress. You know, there's some inherent challenges in trying to build a political force out of the absence of organized religion. You know, sort of by definition, you got some built-in disadvantages there. There is no structure. There is no organization. People don't, you know, show up in congregations and churches and things like that every Sunday to provide that glue that holds them together. So nevertheless, I think the common values, the common threats that we face have provided some of that unity, and we're beginning to see a little bit of political muscle in the secular community. If we can figure out a way to bring that structure and organization that certainly the religious community has as a built-in advantage, that'll be critical.
Well, I thought it was a really good sign that the Democrats in Congress, in the House, have dropped the religious oath for witnesses who are swearing in. And they did that kind of quietly at the beginning of the year, and then I know there's been some pushback. But that shows respect for the Constitution and an increasing awareness that many of us just don't believe in a God.
Well, unfortunately, it's been kind of a sporadic standard. Some committees have dropped the oath, others have not. I sit on the Natural Resources Committee, and in our original proposed rules for the committee, we proposed that we drop the oath, or we allow witnesses to simply say it voluntarily if they chose to, which to me, you know, makes perfect sense. And wouldn't you know it, Liz Cheney just went ballistic. She smelled blood in the water, went on Fox News, and, you know, started ranting about how Democrats were dropping God from the Congress. And at our next meeting, the Republicans, one by one, made these pronouncements about how, you know, we shouldn't be against God, and Democrats were against God. And unfortunately, my Democratic colleagues backed down, and so we now nominally still have that same oath. But you're right; it's unconstitutional to require a witness in congressional testimony to affirm an oath to a deity they may not even believe in, or to affirm an oath to a singular deity when you might be a polytheistic Hindu, for example. It's just preposterous. If we were to have a hearing on climate change, for example, and we wanted to call, you know, one of the foremost physicists, let's say Neil deGrasse Tyson, he's an atheist. Do we force him to affirm an oath to a God he doesn't believe in? It really, frankly, strains credulity that in this day and age Congress would have something like that, and yet some of the politics persist.
It's discourteous, but it shows that God is still a gotcha issue.
Yeah.
Well, and it's so refreshing.
God is a political opportunity for many of my colleagues.
And it's so refreshing to hear a member of Congress speak the way you are about it. And it is a political opportunity. And we're seeing a rise of Christian nationalism right now. This idea that the United States was founded as a Christian nation and that we've sort of strayed from that foundation and need to get back to those godly roots. We're seeing it with things like Project Blitz, which is a state-level push to get Christian nationalist legislation through. And I think even the pushback on the oath can be a form of Christian nationalism. Is this something that you are seeing, that the Congressional Freethought Caucus is looking at and talking about pushing back on anything like that?
Constantly. That's at the heart of why we started this caucus and a lot of the work that we've set out to do.
And I think it is working, I think, because Morning Consult just released a poll that said now 47% of the country sees Christian nationalism as a threat, which is up significantly from before the 2016 election. So whatever you're doing is working, I think.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to, I can't take credit entirely for that. I think, frankly, the overreaching of people like Donald Trump and others who are so blatantly using religion to advance demagoguery and dark agendas, thankfully, that data suggests that the American people are seeing through it and figuring it out, and that's a good thing.
And speaking of the data, there is this other goal of the Congressional Freethought Caucus, and that's to work to base policy on science. And there seems to be this intimate tie, and you've spoken about it, between science and secularism and state-church separation.
It's very important, and that's why, frankly, we've got a couple of scientists that are part of the Freethought Caucus. We're constantly invited to make policy based on things other than science and reason and facts. Climate change is, maybe the greatest example of this. Honestly, this is no exaggeration. I have colleagues across the aisle who just can't get their head around why we would make policy based on future generations to come when, the rapture is probably just around the corner. They literally think that way and they talk that way. Pretty scary stuff. You see it in foreign policy all the time. To some extent, the fervent militaristic support of Israel, the constant push for war in the Middle East. Some of my colleagues advance these ideas because they want to bring on the end of days and a great glorious Armageddon that will hasten the coming of the Messiah. This is dangerous, crazy stuff, and it belongs nowhere in our public policy.
Absolutely.
So there's a great deal at stake, Representative Huffman, here maintaining the secular government, constitutional separation between religion and government, having evidence-based social policy, and not having dogma in our laws. And I wonder if you might talk a little bit about the concern that we all have now with reproductive rights.
Yeah. This may be the greatest example of all, where certain fundamentalists are so fervently opposed to abortion that they are willing to pass these laws and chip away at women's reproductive choices. And it's being fought out in state legislatures, in the courts, but also continuously in Congress. Every single year we'll have multiple battles over the Hyde Amendment and other things. So it's a great example. It's entirely based on religion. And frankly, that just can't be the way we make public policy, much less a policy so deeply personal as to what a woman is allowed to do with her body.
I'm so pleased to see that there now is debate and attention being directed to that Hyde Amendment that cuts off federal assistance for abortion care for indigent and low-income women who otherwise can get health care through the government. That hasn't been done for a while. And of course, that was led by Henry Hyde as a Roman Catholic who believed that personhood begins at conception. Do you see any, are you looking at maybe after 2021, we might actually have a chance to repeal the Hyde Amendment?
Well, I think we should. Whether the politics are there, I don't know. I certainly think the 2020 election will be very consequential on that issue, and many, many others.
And what are the Congressional Freethought Caucus's plans for a post-Trump? Let's say the 2020 election, Trump is no longer in the White House. And you get a chance to go on the offensive. What would be the number one thing you would want to do?
Not to put you on the spot.
Wow, wouldn't that be? I like thinking about that. I hope that's in store for us. But look, it would be great to stop playing defense against all of these crazy ideas and start advancing some policies based on science and facts. So yeah, that's the offense side of what the Freethought Caucus is all about. to listen to the scientists that are telling us that we have a biodiversity crisis and an extinction crisis, that climate change is driving that, and many other threats to not just our national security interests, but to the entire world. Those are great examples. I'm sure there are many others, but I would start with that.
And any words to members of Congress about coming out of the closet, just as parting words here?
I think people should just be themselves. This is my personal bias here. I think voters reward authenticity and honesty. They don't expect people to think and act and worship exactly as they do. They're much more concerned with, do we have a common set of values? And so that's the other part of my coming out as non-religious that I would stress. I've tried to be very clear about the moral and ethical values that guide my public service and my life. Sometimes people think that if you're not religious, you don't have a moral code, and that's really not the case. So I've tried to convey that, again, in a way that's respectful of other people's faith choices, and I think it works. I think people actually respect it, even if they don't necessarily agree with it.
Well, we certainly respect it, and we thank you so much, Representative Huffman, for your courage and your leadership, and for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us on Free Thought Matters.
Because free thought matters.
Hi, I'm Steve Pinker. In my book, Enlightenment Now, I show that the world has become a better place as reason has been overcoming superstition and tribalism. But the values of the Enlightenment are under attack. That's why I'm a proud member of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest association of freethinkers working to keep state and church separate. Please join me in supporting the Freedom from Religion Foundation to ensure that our government is driven not by religion, but by reason.